Welcome to your deep dive on Canada's housing crisis. We're going to try to untangle this complex issue using the expert interviews, news segments, and analyses that you sent. So get ready to maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way. Did you know that Canada has one of the lowest housing supplies per capita in the G7? Pretty wild, right? We're also going to look at how a 1912 Toronto bylaw that banned apartment buildings still affects urban planning today. And we'll also be talking about this thing called the missing middle, which might just hold a key to actually solving this whole crisis.
It really is fascinating because we're potentially facing what's called a population trap here in Canada. Immigration is really important for economic growth, but the rapid influx right now, if there isn't enough housing and infrastructure planning, puts immense strain on the entire system. And this tension is going to be a recurring theme through our deep dive here.
Okay, so to start off, I think we need to redefine what home really means in this context.
Absolutely. I think it's easy to just get caught up in talking about affordability. But as housing policy researcher Carolyn Weitzman argues in her book Home Truths, we have to consider the intangible aspects of home as well. Things like dignity, belonging, and community are really rarely factored into policy discussions, but they're fundamental to well-being.
You're totally right. And it makes you think, how does your definition of home influence your views on the housing crisis? Do you just think about affordability above all else? Or are factors like community and stability equally important to you? So to understand how we got here, we kind of have to take a little trip back in time. Canada actually had relatively affordable housing back in the mid-20th century. So what happened? What changed?
Well, the 1970s were a huge turning point. There was this perfect storm of policy shifts. They seemed like good ideas at the time, like the capital gains tax exemption on primary residences, which coincided with broader economic factors. And this kind of unintentionally transformed housing into an investment vehicle. And that's what really drove up prices and fueled speculation.
It's like this huge chain reaction, right? Weitzman actually highlights the example of Montreal's Plex culture. So back then, long-term rentals in duplexes and triplexes were very common. That kind of renter security is unheard of today in a lot of Canadian cities. So that leads us right into a potential solution, the missing middle. It's a term we hear more and more these days.
Yeah, the missing middle refers to housing types that bridge the gap between detached homes and towering high-rises. Think duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, and laneway suites. They offer more density without the massive footprint of a skyscraper.
And as that CBC segment about that showed, zoning regulations often favor single-family homes. So even if people want these missing middle options, they're just restricted by outdated rules.
It's kind of like we're trying to fix a modern problem with outdated tools. Architect and urban planner Nama Blonder gives this shocking example. In 1912, Toronto actually banned apartment buildings completely. They were afraid they would lower property values and attract undesirable residents.
Yeah.
And even though it's not law anymore, that mindset still has influence today in planning.
It's crazy to think that a century-old bylaw is still impacting how our cities are built today.
Oh, and it's not just Toronto either. Vancouver's having a debate over floor space ratios.
Yeah.
It's this metric that determines how much square footage you can build on a lot. Advocates argue that increasing these ratios, particularly for multi-unit dwellings, would encourage a wider range of housing options.
So we've got the historical context, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, and that's immigration. Canada prides itself on being welcoming to newcomers, but record-breaking immigration levels are definitely putting a strain on housing.
Of course. And this tension was really noticeable during the CBC panel discussion. Immigration is definitely vital to Canada's economy, but the current pace, without some proactive housing and infrastructure planning, has made the crisis worse.
I remember they played these sound bites from everyday Canadians who were struggling to afford housing amidst this record influx. It was a good reminder that this isn't just an abstract policy debate. It's affecting real people's lives.
And Economics Explained highlighted the potential economic consequences of all this. If Canada's per capita output doesn't keep up with population growth, we risk a decline in overall prosperity, which could ultimately hurt everyone.
And there's another layer to this. They talked about the issue of diploma mills. Those institutions that exploit international students by giving them subpar education. But they use their visas as a way to enter Canada, so it adds another dimension to the conversation about who actually benefits from our immigration system.
It's a really complex issue, and there are no easy answers. We have to acknowledge the vital role that immigration plays in Canada's economy, but we also have to be honest about the pressure it puts on housing and social systems.
Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about a specific approach to tackling homelessness, housing first.
Right. So Housing First prioritizes immediate housing for people experiencing homelessness,
Right.
and then they get support services as needed. And the evidence is clear. It's very effective in reducing chronic homelessness.
But there is a caveat. The program shared the story of Brian Dean, a landlord in Ottawa who rented properties to people through a Housing First program. He found that the support services that were promised often fell short. So he was left with damaged properties and difficult tenant situations.
Yeah. It's really important to remember that for Housing First to succeed, there needs to be adequate funding for those wraparound services and also consent from the participants. Housing expert Tim Aubrey really emphasized that you just can't force someone to accept help, even if it seems like the best option.
It's this balancing act between providing support and respecting individual autonomy. And it highlights that housing policy needs to do more than just put a roof over someone's head. We need to address the root causes of housing insecurity. So we've been talking about complex systems, and we also can't forget the developers. The role in this is often oversimplified. The solution always seems to be to just build more. But as we've seen, it's just not that straightforward.
Yeah, the CBC segment used the abandoned condo project in Kitchener as a case study, and it highlighted how rising construction costs, interest rates, and labor shortages can just derail even well-intentioned projects. It's a big reminder that the development industry doesn't operate in a vacuum.
And then you have the pre-sale model. This is where developers rely on early sales to secure financing. So it makes them incredibly vulnerable to sudden market shifts, like, say, a global pandemic or subsequent economic upheaval.
Exactly. The build more mantra totally ignores the financial realities and risks that developers face. It's not a simple supply and demand thing. It's way more complex. You've got economic forces, government policies, and market conditions.
It feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers so far. But don't worry, this deep dive is far from over. We'll be back in the next part to explore potential solutions and think about what role you can play in shaping a more equitable housing future for Canada. Welcome back to our deep dive into Canada's housing crisis. So we've seen it's this super tangled web of historical policies and economic forces and even changing social values. But in all of this, are there any glimmers of hope?
Yeah, definitely. There were actually a lot of potential solutions and paths forward that came up in the sources that you provided. For example, Carolyn Weitzman talks about needing a more nuanced approach to housing policy in general. She says instead of focusing just on home ownership, we should try shifting our mindset and thinking more about a housing continuum. It would be a system that provides more options, from secure rentals to different types of ownership, and they would all have strong tenant protections.
That makes a lot of sense. Not everybody wants to own a detached house, and not everyone can afford it either. And as we learned with Montreal's Plex culture, secure rentals can actually foster these really stable and vibrant communities.
Absolutely. And when it comes to actual policies, Weitzman says we need super clear and consistent definitions for affordable housing and homelessness. Then we could collect better data.
Yeah.
And this is important. We would have a way to actually measure how effective these policies are. Like Finland's success in dealing with homelessness is partly because they have a rigorous national housing count. Canada doesn't have that.
Wow, it's true what they say. You can't manage what you can't measure.
Yeah.
If you don't have accurate data, it's impossible to know where to put resources or even hold policymakers accountable. So those missing middle housing types, remember, they seem like a really good way to increase density without relying on massive high-rises.
For sure. Nama Blonder and her firm, Smart Density, are big supporters of this. They show that even making small changes, like converting garages into laneway suites or allowing garden suites, can add a lot of much-needed housing.
Oh yeah, those visuals from the CBC segment were really something. Just adjusting the floor space ratio, that thing that determines how much you can build on a lot, that could actually really change the housing landscape, and it would allow for way more multi-unit dwellings.
But it's not easy. As we saw with that proposed 13-unit project in Vancouver, navigating all the zoning regulations and getting approvals takes forever. It's so complicated, it took them 7 years just to get through the initial stages.
It's crazy. It's like the system is working against these innovative, density-focused projects.
And then there's that not in my backyard sentiment that always comes up whenever someone proposes density. People are worried about their property values or not enough parking or more strain on local services. But Blonder makes a good point. These concerns are usually from misinformation or people just putting their own individual needs ahead of the collective good.
She said we'd rather protect our backyards from shadows than provide homes for people, which really says a lot about our values. Okay, so we've got this missing middle housing type, but what about tackling homelessness more directly? Housing First sounded promising, but those stories from Ottawa made it seem more complicated.
Well, the case of Brian Dean, the landlord who had damage to his properties, just highlights how important those wraparound support services are. Housing First isn't about just giving someone a place to live. It's about dealing with the underlying issues that cause homelessness in the first place, like mental health issues and addiction and the lack of social support.
And Tim Aubrey, the housing expert, said it has to be up to the person. You can't force someone to get help, even if it seems like it's best for them.
Yeah, and this brings up something really important. There are proven models out there, like Housing First, but they only work if they're funded and there's political will behind them. Governments often say they'll deal with homelessness, but they don't commit the resources that are needed for real long-term solutions.
It's that short-term thinking versus long-term investment thing. A Band-Aid solution might seem cheaper now, but it ends up costing more later, both in money and in how it affects society. So let's talk about developers again. Remember that abandoned condo project in Kitchener? It showed us that just build more isn't some magic solution.
Right, the CBC segment really showed the developer side of it. Rising construction costs, interest rate hikes, and labor shortages have really made it difficult for developers. Profit margins are smaller, and projects just aren't viable anymore.
And the whole pre-sale model where developers need those early sales to get financing is so risky in this crazy market. Like imagine a pandemic or an interest rate increase happening out of nowhere. It could ruin everything.
And those kinds of shocks are becoming more and more common these days. It makes sense why developers are getting more cautious and pulling out of projects. Or they have to make the units so expensive that most people can't afford them.
It's a vicious cycle. We need more housing. But the things that cause this crisis are also the things making it hard to fix it. So we've looked at some solutions, but there's this bigger question. What's driving this demand? Can we even talk about this without getting into politics?
Well, the elephant in the room is population growth. And that's largely fueled by Canada's immigration policies. It's definitely a touchy subject, but Economics Explained made a good point. If the outcome per person doesn't keep up with how fast the population is growing, our overall prosperity will decline.
Yeah, and during that CBC panel discussion, we heard from Canadians who can't afford housing with all these newcomers coming in. It felt like for a lot of people, immigration is just happening too fast.
We have to make sure we're looking at the facts and not just rhetoric. Yes, immigration puts pressure on housing, but blaming newcomers for a crisis that's been caused by decades of bad policies is wrong and dangerous.
Exactly. We need to talk about this honestly, see how complicated it is, and not look for easy answers or just blame people. Speaking of easy answers, that build more thing seems to be falling apart. So what's the alternative? Do we actually need to have a real discussion about how fast immigration is happening?
That's the question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to answer. Welcoming newcomers is a core part of being Canadian, but we also need to make sure that our economy and social systems can handle it.
It's a hard balance to find. And as we saw with the diploma mills debate, there are ethical issues too. Exploiting international students for cheap labor or driving up housing prices because of foreign investment. We have to ask who really benefits from immigration the way it is now.
Yeah. We can't just look at the numbers. We need to think about the quality of immigration too. Make sure newcomers can get decent housing, fair pay, and the chance to be part of Canadian society.
We have to move away from just thinking about the economics and think about the long-term social and cultural impacts. Can we integrate newcomers in a way that works for everyone? Or are we creating more division and resentment for the future?
That's the challenge. And to do it, we need to be honest and look at all the nuances. And that's usually missing from our politics.
So we're back to that tension. We need economic growth. But it can also put strain on how our society works. There has to be a way to make these things work together, right?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And in our final part, we're going to look at some possible ways forward. And we'll think about how you, as an informed and engaged citizen, can help create a more equitable and sustainable future for housing in Canada.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've talked about so much when it comes to Canada's housing crisis, the history, the economics, even like the values we have as a society. So where do we even go from here?
I know it's a lot. It seems like there are so many interconnected challenges. But I think it's important to remember that even with all of this, there's still hope. And the most important thing is that we can all actually do something to help fix it.
You're right. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed, but it's not about feeling like you can't do anything. It's about knowing what we can actually do, even just as individuals, to make things better.
Exactly. Remember when Carolyn Weitzman talked about checking where our investments are going? That's a great example. A lot of pensions and investment funds actually support developments that make affordability even worse. You can actually do something about that by asking questions and maybe even moving your investments to support better approaches to housing development, more ethical ones that are better in the long run.
It's like voting with your dollars, right? The choices you make about where your money goes sends a message, and that can actually influence the market.
Totally.
And besides our money, we can be more involved in our communities too. Going to council meetings and speaking up about zoning changes or even supporting those missing middle projects, those are the things that can actually make a difference.
It's true. These decisions that shape our cities, they're often made without much input from the people who will be most affected by them. We need to be more involved in shaping our own neighborhoods, and we need to support policies that focus on affordability, density, and having lots of different housing options.
Even just having conversations with your friends and family about the housing crisis can help. You can share what you learned from this deep dive, and that might help break down some of the stigma. And maybe it'll even get people motivated to make a change.
We need to stop thinking about it as us versus them. It's not homeowners against renters or immigrants against people who have lived here longer. We're all in this together, and we need solutions that work for everybody. That's exactly it. And that's why I think the idea of a housing continuum is so important. It challenges this whole idea that owning a home is the only way to feel secure. We need a system that has more options. Things like secure rentals, co-ops, different ways to own a home, and they all need strong protections for tenants.
It's about recognizing that home means different things to different people. Our housing policies should show that.
Exactly. And we can't forget about those other ideas we talked about. Things like missing middle housing, like laneway suites, garden suites, and multiplexes. We can add more density without having to build those big high-rises, and they usually fit right in with the existing neighborhoods.
We saw that they face a lot of pushback, though, right? And
Yeah.
not because they don't work, but because of outdated zoning rules and people just don't like change. And that's where speaking up can really make a difference. We need to support policies that focus on these new creative solutions.
And when we talk about actually dealing with homelessness, we can't just use temporary fixes. We need to commit to programs like Housing First that have been proven to work. But remember, it's not just about giving someone a place to live. It's also about making sure they can get the support they need: mental health care, help with addiction, job training, and a good support network.
Yeah. People don't just end up homeless for no reason. There are usually bigger societal issues involved. Poverty, inequality, discrimination. We have to deal with those things if we really want to fix the problem.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that main tension we talked about, the need for a good economy, but the strain it puts on how our society functions. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
And remember what Economics Explained said. Canada could fall into a population trap if the output per person doesn't match how fast the population is growing.
It really makes you think.
Yeah.
And it shows how important it is to talk about immigration in a more honest and balanced way. It's super important for our economy, but we need to make sure that our growth is manageable and we're planning for it properly.
We need to stop thinking in such black and white terms. We need to find common ground where we can have a strong economy and everyone has a good quality of life too. Can we really have a system that welcomes newcomers and makes sure that everyone has a decent place to live, good jobs, and a sense of belonging?
That's the million-dollar question, right? We have to think long-term, not just quick fixes. We need a vision for Canada that's more fair and equal. It's a huge challenge, but it's one we need to face.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd encourage you to go back and look at the sources you gave us. What stuck out to you? What made you want to learn more? But most importantly, what role do you see yourself playing in making Canada's housing situation better and fairer for everyone?
You're not just watching this happen. Each one of us can do something. Stay informed, get involved in your community, speak up for change, be careful where you put your money. Each action helps build a Canada where everyone has a place to call home.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.